Good morning, Flutarians. Today I'm welcoming Katherine Werbiansky. She works for Voice Revolution. In fact, she's the CEO, owner, producer, the Voice Revolution. And we connected because I was just scrolling on TikTok one day, like I do sometimes, looking for videos to duet for you guys. And I heard her talking about the power of the voice and how our voice is the only instrument that goes with us anywhere, and it has such it's so tied to our soul that it has an ability to, well, express our inner state, I guess is one way to say it. We could talk about this all night, I'm sure, but I want to give you the chance to tell us, the flutarians, those who are watching now and in the future, so what is it that you do?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for the intro. My name is Katherine Werbiansky. Yeah, I created Voice Revolution in the middle of the pandemic. Realized that something really powerful was going on with teaching voice and felt like, wow, there really is so much here that is therapeutic, but I wanted more tools to be able to hold that kind of space for my clients. So throughout the pandemic, I got trained in internal family systems therapy and somatic stress release therapy and combined that with voice. So that way there is a true sense of holistic holding for space for people's voices to feel welcomed, uninhibited, free to connect to themselves. Yeah, I think when I started teaching about 10 years ago, I had a career as an opera singer for a while, but then as I delved more into opening my own studio and teaching, I didn't realize how I guess like how the population is traumatized away from using their singing voice. Like the general population, unless you're exposed to singing or you feel like you grew up with music or were in a choir at some point, I was finding over and over again that people were more and more had an origin story of where their voice was told singing's not for you, music's not for you. And my whole system went, absolutely not. We are going to build something to try and maybe rectify that. So yeah, through Voice Revolution, I provide therapeutic vocal coaching for anyone.
Wow. Well, one of the ulterior motives, perhaps, for my flutists is that I would like them to experience an opening up of the voice, because in my experience in music school, just doing a little bit of voice training, solfege, and ear training, stuff like that, immensely helped my flute playing ability, especially when it comes to improvising music. So
Mm-hmm.
I also started noticing then that even though I was in a music school and I was surrounded by people who supposedly were, really into music, more than half of them were afraid to use their voice.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so I thought that it was really unique when I saw that you were talking to people just about that simple fact that most of us at some point in our lives have had someone say, "Don't sing, you stink." And
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
when we're children, especially, and we're still forming our views about the world and ourselves, that can be really impactful.
Oh, yeah, tremendously, tremendously. Like it never fails to amaze me how I've had clients come in their 50s, 60s, even 70s, and after a couple of sessions, the origin pain point starts to unveil itself, and we inevitably hear something like, the teacher told me to stand in the back of the choir, or somebody told me like, oh, honey, that's just not quite for you. Why don't you go try this thing over here instead? And the way that just shuts down a person's voice for decades was just so sad to me. So it's really beautiful that the pain point is the medicine. And I think that's one of the most beautiful things about it. The very thing we're scared of is one of our most like ancient tools for healing and for connecting to something divine and even bigger than ourselves.
When you said that, I thought of that old game. Oh, we're going on a bear hunt. Can't go around it. Can't go over it. Gotta go through it.
Yeah.
And that is the uncomfortable truth about learning to improvise in general is that it's gonna be uncomfortable at first, probably. And the only way to get through that is to do it. I think sometimes in psychology they call it exposure therapy when we're talking about getting over a phobia, right? And so it's like if you're afraid of spiders, it's like maybe there's a spider in a cage on the other side of the room, and then you move it a foot closer and a foot closer and a foot closer. And so one of the things that I'm trying to do for my flutists who are improving their improvising is create a container where they can experience some of those uncomfortable feelings, but know that I'm not gonna bash them, and the other students that I've allowed into my inner circle are not gonna bash them. This is a safe place to even just say, this is uncomfortable for me.
Yeah, and that's a beautiful place to start, right? So when, like, the way that I use internal family systems therapy in addition with singing, that often is the very first step of nervous system regulation, is just naming what is present. You know, when we even tap into the sound of our voice, is the voice sounding like pressured and urgent, like, okay, I'm gonna do this thing, here we go. You know, or is there like a slower held tension or tightness, or maybe even like a sluggish, like a vocal fry kind of sound, because a part of your nervous system might feel kind of frozen around that idea. So the voice can tell us where in our nervous system we might be kind of guided towards in that hierarchical system of like fight, flight, freeze, spawn, kind of going into like collapse or shutdown. But ideally, if we just name, hey, a part of me is nervous, a part of me is really freaking out right now, just naming that alone and naming that that part is here with us in the room is a way to say, hey, there are, like Dick Schwartz, the creator of IFS, says, there are no bad parts. We just need to give them space to express and share how they're feeling, and maybe even include them in the sound making process.
I'm still catching up to the language or the verbiage of this idea of internal family parts. The way I would personally sum it up is that our personalities are made up of many facets, and that each of those could maybe have a name. Sometimes I call them my own best parent, the bully, the cheerleader, the child, the little girl or little boy. I guess there's lots of names that they could be, but it's like each of us is all of those different things existing in this one body. I'm sure it gets confusing sometimes with the words of like, oh, is this multiple personalities? But even so, I think it's probably good to suspend any judgment about the idea of multiple personalities for a moment to consider who is that bully who's telling me this is unsafe. And I really wanted to partner with you because your language is better than mine about talking about the nervous system. When we're nervous about playing music, it's not just all in our head. It can affect our whole bodies.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And to your point about multiple personalities, the idea is that every mind is inherently multiple, right? Like they can even see babies, infants within the first 6 months kind of cycle through up to like 6 different kinds of sounds and ways of crying and being. So parts of our ego, our sense of self, inherently multiple. And what happens is that over time, through different experiences, these parts start to experience the fact that, oh, expressing myself that way is not okay. Oh, expressing myself that way gets me rejected. Oh, expressing myself this way is definitely not going to make me the popular kid in school. So then we start to layer on top of these emotions and these inner children protective parts. And these protective parts will have different strategies to keep us from feeling these original pain points of shame or rejection of vulnerabilities of any sort. But the beautiful part about internal family systems is that it considers the entire system whole. You are greater than the sum of all your parts. So this idea of self-energy being at the core center of you has this massive window of tolerance that can truly hold space for any feeling, any sensation, any emotion that comes up. And when we talk about then the idea of like multiple personalities, or maybe even like something, more pathologized like DID, dissociative identity disorder, really that just means we have maybe like one or two parts or factions of parts that it doesn't feel quite safe enough in the system to even acknowledge that there is a core center at the self to refer to. So it's like the parts aren't quite safe enough to even acknowledge or be aware of each other. But that multiplicity is inherent in every person.
A moment ago, I think you used a phrase, something like strategies for dealing. And I'm curious if you could name any of those off the top of your head, because they might be familiar to us listening.
Oh yeah, like I feel like the first part that a lot of performers I work with, we start getting to know it. You may have called it your inner bully, or like the inner critic. So the strategy itself of self criticizing, right? Like these parts don't learn to do that out of nowhere. They tend to pick it up from caregivers, teachers, in any institutions that they're involved in. So what we start to do is kind of interview that coping strategy of maybe perfectionism or self criticism, and we kind of interview them and go, well, what are the kinds of things that you say to Vic, or what are the kinds of things that um, that you say? How long have you been saying these things to him? You try and kind of find the origin story of that protection. And then one of the main questions we ask in IFS is, what is your concern? Like, what do you think will happen to this person if you didn't have that role inside? And that question then kind of reveals like, oh, well, I'll be rejected, or my parents won't approve of me, or I won't land the gig, and therefore I won't get the attention that I'm really like needing and craving, or validation inside. And that tends to point to the exiled or like repressed emotion that is needing some inner reparenting.
Mm. Yeah, hearing you talk about that strategy of an interview reminds me of one of the most useful strategies I've been given, which is asking the question, what is the worst possible outcome? Until you actually get to the worst possible outcome. Because usually the first answer is not the real answer. Like,
Mm-hmm.
for example, in an improv class and discussion a few weeks ago, I asked someone what's the worst possible outcome, and we finally came around to the worst possible outcome is you could choke on your spit and die, and that would be a bad day in FLUTARIANS Group. But
Yeah.
what is that realistic? What are the chances of that happening? And then when we start to
Mm-hmm.
crunch the numbers, it's like, oh, like that's very unlikely to happen. And then we
Right,
can look
right.
at it from a more realistic perspective.
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, that sounds very much related to like CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy techniques, where we're trying to kind of like, how do we know that this thought of this part of you is like really real, and kind of investigating that to the end.
Mm. Well,
Yeah, definitely a strategy.
I'll just summarize a section of my story for those listening who may not know it. When I went to college, I went to the University of North Texas, thought I'm going to play an orchestra when I grow up. But at the same time that I was starting to go to college, my father got sick with cancer and died. And UNT is one of the most extreme, it's the biggest music school, so it has the most extreme competition, you could say. And so those combination of events made it to where my will to compete was just utterly crushed at the time. I had no
Yeah.
interest in competing.
Yeah.
And so I changed my degree. I did still graduate with a Bachelor of Arts in Music, but I also got a major in Social Studies. So I was dabbling in sociology, psychology, anthropology classes, getting familiar with some of these ideas of how do people work? What do other professionals out there in the field think about how people work? Learning some of the
Mm-hmm.
language. And for a little while there, I thought about maybe going into like getting a licensed professional counselor degree or something like that. And then my route changed a little bit, but now that I find myself in a position where I've discovered the thing that I have that other people want, at least a few of them, is a confidence level in improvising. And my goal is to get my students at least a 4 out of 5 confidence level in almost any improv scenario. And I've discovered that in doing that, I'm doing a little bit of technique teaching and a lot of mindset coaching.
Completely.
And
Completely.
so when I just saw a little bit of what you were doing, I thought that I bet a lot of what Catherine's doing is similar to what I'm doing as far as just giving people a gentle introduction into changing their mindset about their voice, their instrument, their music. And I'm trying to help people find their unique voice. Wouldn't you say that's something you're doing too?
Yeah, oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And that sense of like finding your unique voice is it's such a beautiful journey because really it's an unveiling and a coming home to what's always been there. But these protective layers of our nervous system that our parts are kind of riding on top of are picking up signals all day whether or not something is safe or not safe. And we do live in a oppressive, violent, competitive, capitalistic colonial world, right? So this idea of music constantly being a competition, constantly being a like a one-upsmanship, I think has put a lot of fear into people around accessing their music and their voice. I hear a lot from folks like, like, oh, well, I'll never make money from this, or I would never win a American Idol or a competition. So kind of what's the point? And the whole point is that you're just you being you simply is the point. That is enough. That is enough reason to be on a journey to accessing your sound and your creative expression in a way that feels whole to you.
Mm. Well, that is a discussion that I find myself in probably more frequently than I prefer about music is, well, it's not about winning an audition or winning a job. Music, I mean, it may have been for a period of our lives, but that's a recipe for burnout.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah, absolutely. Did the opera thing, got the degrees, had enough of a taste of the career, and I was like, I think I'm too tender for this, actually. I think, there's a lot of, you have so much resiliency up until a point, and then eventually your system's like, there's got to be something that I can do that brings a truer sense of wholeness to how I want to engage with my craft, my voice, my art, and to have a way of creating more community around that than just beyond the professional performance world.
Yeah, I think I left a sentence out of my own personal short story a moment ago, which was that when I started playing flute again, it was like a music therapy. I was playing along to my dad's favorite songs. I was so motivated by the emotional aspect of the music that I could almost not help myself from playing. And I would start singing along with it, but I'm a better flute player than I am a singer, so I get my flute. Next thing you know it, I'm improvising to classic rock, Beatles and Eagles and stuff like that. Um,
Yeah, absolutely.
I've been so fortunate to get to sit in a variety of musical circles, mostly here in Central Texas, that include singers of all skill levels. There will be people who, like yourself, have performed professionally in operas, and there will be people who you might say could barely carry a tune in a bucket. But for me, as a flute player or just a general musician sitting in with them, I have, I guess, a refined listening skill set where I can listen to someone where the tune may not be um, clear. Like I would have a hard time transcribing the notes, but the intention is so clear that it's a special moment to listen to someone who's sharing their voice, especially if it's a song that they wrote or that has special emotional significance to them. Um, I've learned so much as a flute player by listening to vocalists and trying to replicate that authenticity in my
Mm.
flute. And I'm not exactly sure how it will go with my future flute students as far as combining the voice with flute, but I think that um, when we pick up the flute and add it to our face, it's like an extension of our voice. The flute, the instrument itself, this is not where the music comes from. The music
Yeah.
comes here, and this is like an amplifier. So I think that even if we just define our vocal range as very small, this is all that I'm going to work with, this is all I'm comfortable working with, that we can still find an authenticity in our voice, um, and project it onto our flute. So
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. That's a really beautiful way of describing it. Yeah, flute was, well, piano was my first instrument, but then fifth grade had an aunt with a flute. So that was my then given instrument to go from. It was like the uncle gave my older sister clarinet. I was given a flute. And in so many ways, I'm so grateful that flute was a big part of my childhood musical experience, because if things were too scary to express with words or emotions, especially as a neurodivergent person, it was like, well, all of that expression is just going to flow through this thing that gives me some type of containment and safety in the expression. It gave me just a little bit of a step, not removed, but it gave me, yeah, that safety of holding an instrument, maybe that, like, similar to the safety of like working with someone that sings, but they feel safer with that guitar, kind of like grounding them in. I almost feel like flute was a way to, like that exposure therapy idea, kind of titrate in the idea that using your breath and your sound and your vibration, even just raw with the human body and the voice, is the medicine. So flute was definitely a huge blessing on this path.
so how long did you practice flute?
From fifth grade to senior year, and then when it came to uh, majoring in voice, they made it very clear that like singing had to be my main focus, and that there were concerns that practicing too much flute or trying to double major would create like a rift in my like singing embouchure, and the kind of like the muscle training that I needed for opera. I question that now that I'm on the other side of the coin, and I'll pick it up every once in a while just to be like, oh yeah, this is another way for me to express, which has been really nice.
Well, I'll get you tied in with my classes as they progress throughout the years, but wow, that's really cool. I'm curious, have you been singing all your life, or was there, like, how does the timeline of studying flute as a teenager fit in with your timeline of studying the voice?
Yeah. I mean, I grew up in a Ukrainian Orthodox church and lived in a choir loft with a bunch of old babas, and no piano or organ or anything, like super kind of ancient feeling, and growing up in that kind of a church. And so I was just surrounded by like a wall of like Slavic women singing. So that was definitely my exposure at first was through church. And then realizing probably around the same time in fifth grade, joining a choir, getting solos, and being like, oh, okay, this is a space that I apparently am getting some traction in, that I'm guess I'm kind of good at it. And that rolled into being in musicals, and then eventually going like, okay, what do I want to study? I guess singing's always been it. Let's see where this path continues to take me.
Hmm. There's a, you know how sometimes as we grow up, our parents confess little secrets about raising us, and one of the sweet secrets I have from my dad was that when I was 3 and 4 years old, he would press his ear to my bedroom door and listen to me singing. Which, if I had known at any point in time, I would have been like, oh no, like I can't believe someone's listening to me. But now, in retrospect, it's like, oh, that's really sweet, and
Yeah.
it's interesting to me to know that I was already singing at 3 years old. I
Hmm.
was already, I was going to church with my family, and we were listening to music in the car, listening to music at church, listening to people sing right in front of me, and so I guess I was already internalizing it. But listening to you talk about getting your first voice solos in middle school reminds me that I probably didn't play a solo in the band on flute until I was at least like in ninth grade, maybe 10th grade. And I think that's a common experience. I think actually there's hundreds, thousands of flute players out there who've never ever played a solo. And so when I was
Sure.
13 and 14 and 15, and the church that I was going to asked me to play solos for the service, piano and flute, that was out of my comfort zone. I did it, and that's when I
Hmm.
started gaining experience with that feeling of having the spotlight on me. But when I think back to you at 12 and me at 12, one of the differences I see is that you were more confident with the spotlight than I would have been at that time in my life, or at least I'm imagining that to be the case. So, um, bringing that back around to what we're doing now and who we're working with now, I feel like for a lot of the flutists who are filtering into my world, that I'm giving them the tools to react when the spotlight is on them, and um, that's a little different when there's no sheet music in front of you than when there is, but it's still a lot of the same feelings of how do I own this moment. And so I guess there are some skills that we give people for dealing with that. I feel like I'm doing a whole
Yeah.
lot of talking. I'd be really curious to hear more about just maybe a couple of the methods that or tips or techniques that you find most useful with your students as they start coming to you.
Sure, sure, absolutely. Well, in terms of like getting used to the spotlight, I think that's still something I struggle with. I think it's still something I'm on like an eternal uh, path on, because of being neurodivergent. And I work with a lot of neurodivergent folks. Part of what I have found for myself and others is that there was so much safety to be on the stage because you were given a script. You knew exactly what notes to play. You even got to practice those emotions.
Mm-hmm.
And so there was like a lot of containment and safety to be neurodivergent and to have that accessibility to self-expression through a highly curated experience. So I've actually found that a lot of neurodivergent folks have found safety on the stage, but tend to have more difficulty off of the stage and navigating other parts of the industry and things that are going on with them, working with their managers or working with just other collaborators and whatnot, and translating that nervous system safety and regulation that they feel there. It's like, oh, well, how can we take that sense of safety and bring it into these other areas of your life? Um, but then for other parts of the population that I work with, yeah, it's this idea of was joy, was like a joyous creative self-expression tolerated in your home? Was that something you were ever ashamed about? Sometimes people have stories of like, yeah, I would sing and be in my self energy and expressing, and then that was when I was told like that's not okay, shut it down. And so it's kind of it's almost like musical reparenting, where we go back into maybe some of those memories and see if we can help that exiled inner child or emotion feel that spotlight of your self energy. And when this kind of like inner spotlight feels like it can shine itself internally on these places that once were kept in shadow, then we kind of gather that own internal spotlight. And then when we take the stage, we talk about how it's like you become a tuning fork then through your nervous system safety for your audience to kind of co-regulate with you. And then you take them on this musical experience through the safety that you're finding in your expression. So the methods to get there, I use are addressing just base level nervous system. We do a thing called the vibe check method, where we're checking in with the V of your voice. What's your voice sounding like? Is it sounding like high and tightened and pressure filled? Is it a little more lethargic? Is there a melodious, calm flow to it at the moment? So we check in with where you are in the nervous system, and then we do regulation exercises for depending on which kind of rung of the ladder you're feeling yourself at. So a lot of it is using breath and sound and movement, lots of kind of voice and yoga things together, just to come back to a centered sense of self. And then when we go to sing, if we notice like, oh, I'm going to practice this thing, or I'm going to make the sound, and I just can't help but hear my inner critic shame me before I even open up my mouth, then we just work with who's there. We go, okay, inner critic, grab the mic. Like, you get the mic. Let's let you actually make sound with us. What is your experience like? If you were to be a sound, if your inner critic had a sound, what would their voice or their sound be like? And so just by inviting them in a little deeper into the process, it helps that inner child actually feel respected and heard for the role that they've had inside of protecting you and protecting vulnerability. And then over time, that builds what we call in IFS a self-to-part relationship. So over time, you can even ask this part of you, when you notice it come up before a performance, you could say something like, hey, inner critic, I know you're here. I know you live in my nervous system to protect me from being shamed, from being hurt. And you give, if it feels authentic to you, you give them a sense of gratitude and thank them for the job that they've done, and let them know that you've got it from here on out. And ask them, could you kind of sit next to me while I do this performance? Would you be willing to unblend, maybe sit in the wings and watch me go do this performance? And over time, that really does build a somatic sense of self-trust.
Wow, wise words there, I think. What I'm really appreciating about what you just said is that oftentimes we, or I, don't acknowledge that my inner bully or inner critic is there to serve a purpose. And you acknowledge that they're there to serve a purpose. The purpose it serves is to prevent us from being shamed by our community, right? Because if we're shamed by our community out in the original human existence or whatever, we'll be shunned, we'll be eaten by a dinosaur, I don't know, something like that, right? It's bad news. And so that serves a purpose in our lives, but it may not deserve the extreme fight or flight response that we're giving it these days. Mm-hmm. So, and also as you're describing that experience, I was imagining saying to my flute players, if they're letting out the voice of the inner critic, we'll play it bad. What does that sound like?
Yeah, absolutely. Invite the experience in. Like, what does, like, I like to challenge folks and say, and just let them know, like, sound has no moral value. It just doesn't. It's a sound. It's a sound. It has no moral value. It just is. So what's it like to have some titration or exposure therapy to the idea that, like, a quote bad sound can exist, and it doesn't mean anything about your inherent worth as a musician and an artist.
Mm-hmm. And I'm also reminded of a mantra that another Katherine in my life passed on to me, which is, do it messy. It's okay to do it messy. There may be scenarios in our life when it's not okay to do it messy. When it comes to learning to use your voice, learning to improvise on flute, if there's no high stakes going on here, do it messy. You'll make more progress from doing anything than from being stuck in a state of fear and frozenness.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I think that's where my road eventually needed to diverge from opera, because it's, I mean, just such a high stakes kind of art form, and how it can just take that perfectionist part and that inner critic and put it on this intense hamster wheel, because there is not a lot of room for error traditionally in the classical traditions. So to be able to kind of break away from that and be like, oh yeah, I actually fucking love rocking out and like adding distortion to my voice and doing all these other types of things that would have definitely not been allowed. I found that just staying in one kind of musical genre actually made me exile other types of music that I wanted to be making. So it was nice to acknowledge that it gave me a great foundation and pedagogy, but it was a launching pad for other sounds that I wanted to make.
Mm-hmm. I've certainly found that my experience in conservatory style classes has made it to where, oh, if I want to get that Ron Paul style sound or that Galway style sound, I can go and grab it. It's accessible to me, but now I have a more flexible range of like flute vocabulary words that I can draw from. And what you were speaking about of being kind of boxed into the classical style resonates with me and my conversations with other flutists. And I want to bring up a conversation that I got to listen to at the National Flute Association convention about focal dystonia, or just dystonia in general, which could be described, I guess, as a nerve injury or disorder where it makes it impossible or difficult, for example, to form your embouchure like you're accustomed to create, a specific type of sound. In fact, one of, I think his name is Mark Wallace, was talking about how he was practicing so hard to make it into the young adults flute competition that he practiced himself into injury. It is actually possible to injure yourself playing flute. And then we were talking about how doing something totally different, a totally different style of music, improvisation or pop or rock or whatever, something other than classical, was one of the ways to help the brain create new neural pathways to go around that previous injury. And yesterday when I was chatting with Cassie Elizabeth, she said that when she went back to playing classical style flute after a 4 years of burnout, basically, that the moment she picked up a piece that she'd been playing and before in her classical life, her teacher said, let's do something else, because it initiated that same neural pathway of, oh my god, I have to ace this audition, or those sorts of feelings. So, gosh, I'm really just kind of rambling here, sharing how other people have had similar experiences to you, including myself.
Yeah. No, that tracks very much for the vocal world as well. You're exactly right. That neural pathway just grooves itself over and over again. And you go back to arias or things that you sang early on in your career. And that's why they would always suggest, like, don't go too big, too fast with certain repertoire, because you want to be able to keep a freshness and really build slow, steady neural pathways that you want to come back to. And so going back and singing an old aria, even though it's been years and you think you would just have a fresh palette, it's amazing how quickly the sound kind of encapsulates a moment in time, brings all of that memory back up into your body, and you're like, what? I sing way harder shit than this. Why is this really tripping me up right now? And it's usually because in the brainstem, you have maybe a 20-year-old that is being activated in your nervous system, in your body, with how they encoded those neural pathways and those memories at that time. But that's where IFS is revolutionary in the psychotherapeutic world, because you can actually, with the permission of the protectors that would protect a harder feeling or memory, go into it and retrieve that exiled emotion and help them get a redo, help them kind of re-script how they would have wanted someone to help guide them in that moment. And that, as studies show now, that actually does create new neural pathways. And the brain and the body are self-healing when we have the right supports and tools.
Are you talking about kind of recreating or like creating a new story for that moment?
Yeah, yeah, you can when you are either an IFS therapist or practitioner, there's this ability. It's also just um, based on a lot of different. It's a spiritual psychotherapeutic model, so it is also based on a lot of shamanistic practices. So the idea is that you really do time travel through the brainstem and go backwards into that past memory, and with that inner spotlight of self energy, and with you can also call on the practitioner or therapist self energy to help you and help that younger one feel a new story be encoded with them, so they don't have to stay stuck, frozen, playing that groove, kind of like your record skipping there over and over again. And that can really open up just the possibilities.
Mm. Hmm. What else would
Mm.
you like to share with us?
um, Gosh, I'm trying to think of if there's anything else that would be yeah, helpful or applicable. I guess the main thing that I keep learning over and over again is that it really is the simplest of tools that we need to go back to. Just saying hello to what's present, finding finding where that little bit of anxiety or nervousness is in the body. And when you find where that is, it really helps to name it. Like, oh, there's this, like, maybe find like a color or a texture, or what would you call that kind of energy that you're feeling. And we can ask ourselves, like, okay, what if that energy was a person outside of me sitting across from me, and what would you say to this energy that is feeling that way? So just by having a little bit of that shift in perspective of how to reparent an emotion that comes up. I think that's something our entire world is not as skilled at as we thought. And I think the coming back to the body and the emotions and feeling safe in our creative expression is the way forward in a world like ours. So I'm glad that the I'm glad that other instrumental groups are on this train with the voice people too. So it's nice to know that this is starting to happen across genres, across instrumental disciplinaries. So it's really nice to be in community with you all today.
Well, I certainly hope that in the coming years, there can be something like a big circle of people playing all instruments and voices, like circle singing, but where we've got flutes and trombones and all the different instruments, and people are improvising freely but together.
Oh, I love that.
It's such a
Love circle singing, but circle singing with a whole bunch of different instruments. How rad would that be? I'll come to
yeah.
Texas for that.
I'll make it happen. I mean, I've already experienced it in small groups, and it's so profound. One of the gifts that I experience inside of improvisation is the freeness, the feeling of flow that happens, but when combined with other people. I thought I'd hit the super sweet spot when I played in the all region band for the first time, and we all played a scale together and we were actually in tune. And that's cool, and it's
Mhm.
really amazing to play some really intense emotional music with a big orchestra or a wind symphony or concert band. But if you're in a group that's approaching that size and there's no music and everyone is in the state of flow, it's a truly spiritual experience connecting with people that way.
Absolutely, absolutely, because you're experiencing gr- like self energy is a powerful thing, and then when that self energy is amplified by like the tree roots of our nervous systems all vibing together at the same time, yeah, it is incredible, and it's a practice that happens way more in India, having these like giant group vocal musical like mass community healing experiences. And I think my guess is that as like Eastern and Western psychosomatic therapeutic things come together more, I think in the Western world we're going to be seeing more and more of that infused into our daily healing rituals.
Mm. And you said the word roots, and um, when we drum and dance, it actually helps the mycelium of the fungi that's underneath the soil grow. It's so it is quite possible or probable that we as a species play a healing role in the global community, not just us Homo sapiens.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I've one of my other harebrained theories is that like the neurodivergent community I often think of as like the mycelium of people, because there's just so many extra mirror neurons going around, and there's just a lot of reflection and neural connectivity that wants to branch out and
Mm.
find its connection to humanity.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Just a moment ago, you talked about sitting across from another like piece of your personality, or and I just wanted to share another version of that image that's been helpful to me, which is sitting on a park bench with, usually for me it's the little child version of me and the parent version of me, because I feel those little child feelings a lot. I think denying that we have those feelings is exactly that, it's denial. Um,
Yeah.
and so the conversation I frequently have with myself, it's like the parent version and the child version of, it's okay if you feel scared or nervous right now. Here's realistically why that's not something to be concerned about right now. You know, our parents show us how to be safe. You know, when situations are safe, we do that for ourselves. And for me, it could be something as simple as like this: of I'm going on a live stream with someone I don't know very well. There's all these unknown things that could potentially happen. Oh no, what's gonna happen? It's like, okay, Vic, like, what's the worst possible scenario? Okay,
Yeah.
well, realistically, it's not a big deal. So
Absolutely.
I think of it as sitting on a
Absolutely.
park bench.
I love that. Yeah, absolutely. Just sitting next to a friend that needs a little care, a little compassion, a little inner reflection with them can really go a long, long way. And it builds over time. That's a beautiful thing too, is that inner spotlight of self energy does accumulate. It accumulates and builds over time, so that emotional resiliency becomes easier to kind of rubber band back into that core center of self trust.
Mm. Well, for any of our viewers who are watching now, if you have any questions, this would be a good time to drop it in the chat. We'll close up the conversation in a few minutes, but I really wanted to thank you, Katherine, for just taking a few minutes to give us a little slice of your life, to give us some words to start talking about our own experiences with performing and performance anxiety. Would you like to tell us a little bit about maybe any classes or opportunities you've got going on?
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. So I do individual one-to-one sessions online and in person in Chicago. And then I just started recently offering vocal vibe flow classes. So that's where we're moving through voice and yoga movements at the same time in order to feel our instrument from the root to the crown. It gets a little witchy at the end if you're into that. Sometimes we do like a little card pull and just kind of see what is in the energy in the room and the space with us. And then we end with some group sounding and group singing together. And for folks that are nervous about singing out loud or in front of each other, you can turn your camera off, you can turn your microphone off, and know that you're still connected as we make sound together. So those are happening on Tuesdays and Thursdays if you want to check it out.
Cool. Well, I think that's something that might be useful to some of us flutists and or flautists, and I hope maybe at some point in the future we can make a collaboration. Maybe we can do one specifically for wind players. I know some of us have started dipping our toe into yoga and how that can help us get in touch with our full body instrument. And I think doing just a little bit of singing helps us with our wind instruments, our flutes as well.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, that would be lovely.
Well, I don't see any questions filtering in at the moment, so I'll go ahead and say goodbye to our flutarians. Thank you so much for your attention. Thank you for joining us today, Catherine, and
Yeah,
we'll see
my
y'all later.
pleasure.